All right, so let's just jump right in. For the past week, I've been working on documentation. I have a little demo that I just worked on based on a issue that a user was running into, which is very cool to look into in a few minutes. Do you guys have any topics you would like to discuss?
On my side, maybe two topics. One topic is about a PR submitted by Folk number 4772 to add a requester information into workflow execution context. And the other is about the persistence of information in the database, the workflow execution log record and activity execution records, because I understand when you start working on Elsa v3 that about persistence, by default, we try to not log and persist too many things. So you have to opt in to persist information. In Elsa 2, we can, about input and output for an activity, choose if we want to persist or not information. And it seems to that in Elsa 3, we persist everything. And for example, if I have an input of 10 megabytes and 5 activities that will change information in this input, I will store and log in execution log record 10 megabytes in input and output, maybe in the first activity, in the second activity, etc., etc. So for one workflow, I will persist 50 megabytes of data, at least.
Gotcha. Yeah, that doesn't sound too good, huh?
That's all for me. So for me, I will going from as a SQL server to Elasticsearch. In Elasticsearch, we have some sort of compression, so it will be better for me. And the purge mechanism will be, but it could be good to give the ability for the user to decide what we want to store or not.
Definitely. Yep. So currently, if I recall correctly, if you try to pass around non-serialized objects like streams, or maybe streams can be serialized depending on whether you just store the bytes, but let's say you have some service that's not serializable, I think the system will attempt to serialize it, but then handle any exceptions, and then it will just record a literal string called non-serializable or something like that. You have some static control. So with what I mean is, in the source code, in your custom activity, you can mark output properties to be not non-serializable. But of course, as I mentioned, this is static. Maybe you have general purpose activities where some values you do want to capture in the logging and others you don't. For example, files and streams and those kind of things. But what's lacking is the ability to control the persistence from the UI, because you are right. If you have an activity that produces some big object like a big byte array, you don't want that to be persisted as part of the output logging. So workflow variables have an option where you can configure the storage provider, but we don't have it for inputs and outputs, and we need something for that as well. Just let's have a quick look what that might look like. So here, let's say we have WriteLine. Here, this input will always be persisted as part of the logging, including if this will be a very, very large object. So we need some sort of control for that. Similar maybe to the way we can define variables where we have storage. So maybe we need this field as well on inputs and outputs. And then the default will be workflow. But if you want to opt out, you choose memory, or maybe even blob storage. Maybe you want output to be captured. Well, actually, this is purely about logging.
Yes, because I actually stored in the log records.
Yeah, that's the problem, huh?
So it's only about logging, and if choosing, for example, blob storage, it's just choosing blob storage for log record persistence.
Yeah, exactly, for the entire log persistence,
so
not
it's
on an individual input-output level.
So it's more about store or in memory or in the record, the log storage, and for me there is no other choice.
Yeah, exactly. So do you have maybe a UX in mind? What might be sensible? Would you say, well, maybe we need just a little checkbox somewhere, or could we be more clever, perhaps, in determining when to log something and when not?
Maybe I don't think about a checkbox, but maybe to not. I don't know how we can say that to not disturb the user. Just add a tab about persistence, and in these new tabs we can just list the input and output field and check whether we want to store or not the information.
And then would you say that will be an opt-in or an opt-out, or maybe configure the default might be configurable at the application level?
Maybe maybe the default at the workflow level, or maybe at different level, application, workflow, and then it's default, and you can opt in to change. And with this, we can provide for the users the ability to easily change for the workflow, because you want to debug and trust some information. It can change directly on the workflow level, and not just for one or two field, or check all the field. And if you want to use to store a field constantly, he can just check this field at the field level.
I like that. I like it a lot. Let me capture this in a few notes.
And maybe we have to, is this a checkbox or a list with a default store or not stored? For example, if we want to, by default for the workflow, store information, but opt out for a specific property. I don't know.
Yeah, so I was thinking at the workflow level here, maybe we'll have a new tab, or maybe underneath properties, doesn't matter. There will be include all input fields of all activities. So just a single checkbox here. So it's either opt-in or out. If it's enabled by default, all of the inputs will attempted to be included as part of the logging. And then of course you can override on individual activity levels by going to the logging tab, where you can control inclusion or exclusion on the field level, on the input level and output level, I guess. And of course, on the workflow definition level, if you uncheck the checkbox, by default, none of the fields of all of
So,
the activities will be,
so
they will all be excluded unless
you
you enable it.
you don't use the configuration of the application level.
Well, yes, of course. So that would be
Maybe like
the main level.
incident handling strategy. You have a default and maybe some other. And so if we have a storing strategy or a logging strategy, we can have default, which is the application level. Then we can choose something. This new choice is the workflow level, and the same thing at the activity level.
So if I understand correctly, you're proposing a field similar to incident handling strategy. So it would be a drop-down list. So then what would be the possible options?
Default, which is the application level strategy, store or not store, because we can want
yeah,
to
I see.
go to opt out. What is the default strategy?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you use default, that is whatever you configured on the program, on the application level.
Yeah.
And then you can say exclude or include. And if
Yeah.
say include, by default, everything will be included, but you can still override through the list of checkboxes per input field, per activity, whether you want to include or exclude.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. Yeah, that's good. Very good. I think that's a nice solution to the logging problem, because it will generate a lot of data if you have large objects as input outputs.
Yeah.
So that's gonna help a lot. Yeah, good. Thank you. So that's this one, and then you mentioned there's a PR we should look at. So you said 477. Add requester info into workflow. What is a requester info?
Guys, we want to log and to know, for example, who is testing the workflow, who is launching the workflow instance, and the idea interesting. But for me, maybe we should think about a generic object more like the identity object, if it's serializable, to be more large on what we can do with an identity in a workflow execution.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because what is proposed here, it makes sense in terms of functionality. We ultimately do want to know what user or what principal, what security object or context is associated with certain executions for auditing and permission control, which makes sense. But I agree, the implementation needs to be more general purpose. This will be too specific to add this property to the workflow use context. We need to, think about a proper design that's maybe extensible or at least general purpose enough so that it doesn't cater to just this maybe narrow scope. We need to take more. We need to think it through and consider multiple angles. But yeah, it makes sense to do something like this. And actually, this is going to be very important for the next few versions, or one of the next few versions of Elsa, because I know there's a existing customer that is very big on security and auditing. They are going to need it. So odds are that they will have a few ideas as well that we can benefit from.
Okay, great.
Yeah, but this is good. So in any case, what we will do is assign it this project, and then I will add a comment.
Okay.
After the meeting.
Yeah, I already started to say in Discord that we will discuss and maybe choose something more global.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's good. Maybe if you want, you can maybe summarize your responses and maybe his response to add a comment, so we can gather all of the ideas in this issue.
Okay.
Great. Good. So that's this PR. That's this thing here. Documentation. So as you know, we have beautiful v3 documentation at this URL. Actually, also this works without the v3, and it looks good, but there's some small limitations, I think, with this implementation. And I think maybe Jay, it was you who suggested could we have a little copy button, right?
Yeah.
So things like that. And I happen to be looking at a tool from JetBrains, which is called WriterSide. That's this thing here. I think we briefly touched upon this last week as well. And I actually really like it. It has more widgets, more controls we can add, which is very suitable for technical documentation. It has things like, well, I'll just show you on their website here. So this is their documentation of WriterSide itself using WriterSide. This is the UI output, which looks okay. I mean, it's not as beautiful as the version 3 documentation, I think, but it is very structured and it looks very functional to me. But it has things like tabs, which is very useful. They have things like here, so we can basically switch whatever we want on this page. So let's say we have a little tutorial setting up Elsa Studio, and then we could have one tab for Blazor server if you want to do it on Blazor server, and then another one Blazor WebAssembly. So you just switch between those two, and then the content is updated appropriately for whatever target you want to use. So that could be a nice feature to use. Another idea could be to have maybe sections where we target developers specifically, workflow designers specifically. So those will be non-developer persona, and maybe even system integrators or something like that, or DevOps, who are more interested in cluster things like that. But maybe we can also, of course, create those categories in the main menu. I don't know, but there's a lot of options that we can choose from and leverage. So that's what I've been working on. So this is the current version. So I'm porting over one by one the documentation pages and trying to optimize a little bit for the categories. So one idea I had was to mention the different types of application you can configure using Elsa, because maybe you want a standalone Elsa server without UI, that would be this one, or maybe you want just this Elsa Studio because you already have Elsa server set up, and maybe you want to do both. So these are tutorials to help you go through setting that up. Or maybe you just want an ASP.NET Core application that can execute workflows. Maybe those workflows are created in C#, maybe directly from controllers, but you don't care about exposing a REST API that the Elsa Studio can connect with, because that's the difference between Elsa Web and Elsa Server. They're both ASP.NET Core web applications, but this one typically exposes a REST API that can be consumed by the Elsa Studio. And this, of course, is a single application, or technically, one ASP.NET Core application and one WebAssembly project that is embedded inside of the ASP.NET Core application, and then it serves both the Elsa server and the Blazor WebAssembly. So this is a little restructuring that I think will make it better. And then we can add more types, like what if you want to create your own Blazor dashboard, and then you want to be able to reuse Elsa Studio components. So that would be this application type. And this one would be how to use the custom elements exposed from Elsa Studio that you can reuse in a React application, Angular, Vue, etc. So that's the idea behind application types. These, of course, are just these map to these sections here, Docker packages. But there's also a separate prerequisite. This is new, just a general description of what you need before you can get started. And then, of course, there's the introduction. This is what I'm working currently. Of course, it has search. It has very important dark mode and light mode. And we can potentially offer variations of documentation based on Elsa 3, or maybe we want to also have separate documentation for 3.1. So that is supported as well to a certain extent. I don't know if they have a switcher or anything like that, but that remains to be seen. What's your first impression of when you see all this? Do you think, yeah, this is nice, or do you think, well, it's actually worse?
I think it's nice. Since last week, I just take a look at the writer, and it seems very, very interesting. And I think I will also try to write some documentation for my app with this.
Yeah, that's very cool. One thing they also support is the ability to have, here, let me show you. This is the WriterSide project. You can have code snippets that you can embed. So you can write code snippets once in a single location and then reference it multiple times if you need to. So you don't have to go through all of the pages where you created certain code snippets and then update. You can do it in one place. Maybe this will come in handy at some point. If I want to have multiple guides, and instead of having to say, well, first follow this tutorial in order to set up a basic Elsa server, then come back here, I could maybe just repeat certain or include or embed certain topics and or directly code snippets which this thing supports. I don't know if that's a clever format for writing tutorials. At least there's the option.
And then it compile a website, and you just have to deploy.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. So that's it. So here you can see it's just HTML, and you have to. I'm just going to deploy to Vercel, which this one is deployed to as well.
Okay.
So this is a create React app or something, I think, and it's just Vercel is very easy to integrate with or to deploy to. They have all sorts of built-in configurations that's easy to set up.
Okay.
So
can you use it to publish PDF format, or is it only the website?
I think it's in the pipe to be able to publish the documentation in other format in their blog. They mentioned something like this.
Okay, but maybe not yet.
No. Yes.
Oh, okay.
You can print if you want all files.
But it's not the It's not the compile element?
No, I don't know what's going to do. I don't know what it's going to do if I do this. And my printer's turned on, so I'm not going to press print. I was thinking maybe we could try if there's a PDF option. Yeah, I only see export to HTML.
It looks nice.
Right? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. They also, on their website, they talk about plugins. It's better to use a plugin in a proper IDE. So you have also AI assistants and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, that plugin doesn't exist for Writer. It doesn't exist for IntelliJ or something like that.
Mm.
But other than that, I think it's pretty cool. So yeah, definitely, I definitely recommend checking it out in detail. Mermaid diagrams, that's cool. These things, and even API documentation. I'm gonna take advantage of that one as well. So Elsa server, it exposes the REST API as I mentioned. I do need to update it with Swagger annotations to include descriptions and titles and comments and whatever. And then we can generate an open API specification and then use it here. So we will publish it somewhere, or maybe it can be dynamically generated, and that URL maybe we can include directly here in WriterSide. I don't know, but they have the ability to use open API specification. So here they let you provide a path to some YAML file, and then it will generate documentation for you. So I'm curious what that's going to look like. Probably something like this. Create a new document, and you see this. You can collapse, expand. That's nice. JSON example. Yeah, so it looks like a little bit like a Swashbuckle's output, which is better, of course, because there you can even try it out interactively, and I don't think you have that here. Not yet, at least, but maybe in the future. Anyway, moving right along. Oh, here, preview, build, and publish. What's this? Build and publish on GitHub, GitLab, search engine indexing, IntelliJ IDE for better writing.
I have retrieved the information about the output format. It's on the one page of the WriterSide in JetBrains, and I just put it on the discussion. If you take a look at yes.
We believe in web-based documentation, however, sometimes people may need to produce printed format. So we're going to support PDF output in the future. Now that's nice. So there you have it, PDF. All right, so let's see. So that was documentation. Now let's move on to the demo. So just for context, yeah, so this user, M. Jones from Texas, I don't know, or transaction, input, output, maybe, who knows. In any case, so he's been trying out the MassTransit module and the activities, but his question was, what do I provide as input in the activity in order for it to work? So he made a very nice reproduction. So it was easy for me to just see what he did. And then I run into an issue, which I will walk you through now. So he provided two workflow definitions, which I imported. So let's look at this one first. So it's a very, very basic workflow, and it's about this activity. So this is an activity provided by the MassTransit module based on a custom message type. So that message type looks like this. He created a custom module. This is a POC module, and he has two messages that are just simple records that can be used using MassTransit to publish and to receive. So the order created one has these properties, and based on these two messages, we have this activity or two activities, four activities. To publish these two messages and to receive those messages. So this is automatically created or generated by the MassTransit module, which is very nice because it allows you to visually publish and receive messages through a workflow without having to write a consumer. So in MassTransit, you need to write consumers in order to process messages from a queue, but you don't need to do it when using an Elsa workflow. So that's quite powerful. But the question was, what do I input? So when I tried it out, initially it was behaving quite strangely, and there was no way to change the syntax. So in other words, it wasn't a broken feature. So I fixed that just an hour before this meeting, and now it actually works. And I will demo it. So let me walk you through this workflow. The idea behind this workflow is this is some testing, of course. So it's just a starting activity, or it's a write line. We can ignore it. Here we are going to publish an order created message. So it needs as its input a message instance. And so the way this works when using JavaScript, I'm first going to demonstrate JavaScript. Comment this out. So this is a spoiler. You shouldn't look at this. Just look at this. So here what I'm returning is a JavaScript object. So this is not JSON even. This is a proper JavaScript object. And each field in this object has to match, including the casing with the current implementation at least, the members of this class. So order created has these members. So if you initialize a JavaScript object using these members, then it will work. So now this activity will publish a message with these values. Here it's just gonna do some write line and then finish. So we can ignore it as well because this is not important. What is important is how do you then handle these messages? Let's say you have another workflow, which we actually have here. Here we have a workflow that will handle whenever a message or the created message is published. So for that we use the order created trigger, which is also automatically generated by the system or by this MassTransit module based on the order created message type. So as you can see, it's very easy to create just a message type that you want to be able to send and receive, and then the MassTransit module handles the rest. So that's pretty nice. So here, all we have to do is say, well, we drag and drop it, of course, onto the designer, and then we say, I want to capture the received message. So this looks pretty ugly, so we can probably improve this. Basically, this is the complete type name, including the namespace and the assembly, and of course the type name. So we need to provide for a way to make this more user-friendly or readable. But the variable here is defined here. So I created a workflow variable called message of type this thing here. And of course, the user can just select it from a dropdown here. So here we have primitive types, we have some custom types, and of course, automatically added as well. So the user just has to define their message types, and then it's usable as an activity. It's usable as a variable type, so it's strongly typed. So that's what I did here. I selected this as the variable type. And then here I selected it so that whenever a message is received by this trigger, I capture the message in this variable. So that's the idea here. And then here we can do something with this variable. Here I'm just writing a little string and then accessing the message variable, which we have here, using the JavaScript function notation, if you will, and then accessing its total property. So let's see what happens. So I will execute this publish workflow, and then the expectation is it will generate two workflow instances, one for this workflow instance and one for the other workflow we just looked at. So here we go. This worked out successfully. So we see the publish order created with its message initialized to what we provided, and then it finished. And then if we look at the instances, we see indeed MassTransit publish. That's the workflow we just looked at. And this is the one that got triggered because we received an order created message on the service bus. And we can actually see this in the well, we don't see any messages in the queues now because they are processed, but we do see the two queues that were created, one for order completed and one for order created. So this one, of course, is we have been sending messages to and are reading messages from in these two workflows. So here we see that we received the order created message, and here we see that we actually accessed one of its properties. So as you can see, it's very easy this way to orchestrate messaging systems. So if you have messages to publish, they can be published to a queue, and then other workflows in your system, and not even workflows, of course. You can also have workflows that just publish messages, and then you have, from your application, you could have a MassTransit consumer and have logic executing there as you see fit. So very, very flexible. One final thing I wanted to show is that you can use JavaScript, of course, but you can also use C#. And even, I don't think there's JSON here, but if you used default, I'm not sure actually, I didn't try this, but I would expect that this would work as well. Because what I expect to happen here, this is received as a string literal, and the target type being order created, which is a complex type. I think the converter will attempt to deserialize this as a JSON string because it's gonna identify that this is JSON. But let's see if that's true. I haven't tried it, so I don't know for sure. Yeah, okay, so that worked as well. So you have multiple options, just a JSON string, which you probably would better use the liquid syntax for, because then you can even have liquid variables if you wanted to use those, or tags and filters. You can use JavaScript, as I mentioned, just returning the JSON object, but you can also actually instantiate the order created type. So that works too, if you prefer it this way. And because it's a record, its constructor needs to be invoked as a function like this. So in JavaScript, this works. Let me show that this works too. So that worked as well. And finally, in JavaScript and C# syntaxes are very similar. So the difference is very subtle. But here, finally, we can also just instantiate it using the C# syntax. And the difference you may notice is that here, if we look at the order created record definition, the last parameter is a decimal. And if you don't specify the M modifier, then this will be interpreted as a double, and you can't just cast a double to a decimal. So you need to be very explicit here. Otherwise, you will get an error. So if we save this, then we see this worked out as well. So what do you think?
That's great.
Right? I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah. So I'm going to create a new patch release for this one, because I think this is important that it just works. And I will write a bit of documentation to describe how this module works and what you need to do. There are some subtleties that you need to be aware of. So that's documentation, of course, purpose. For example, here in the program, in the use C# call, in order to be able to instantiate these types, you need to, from C# scripting, you need to reference add the assembly and import a namespace. Otherwise, it's not going to recognize this type and other types in the same assembly and namespace. So that's another thing to be documented. And the same goes for JavaScript. In order to be able to instantiate .NET types, you need to register those types with the Gint engine. So that's going to be documented. And I haven't taken the time for Python, but of course this should work for Python as well, or at least we should make it possible to be used with Python. Yeah, so there you have it.
So do you mean to say that types has to be registered? You cannot use arbitrary types?
Correct. You cannot use arbitrary types. You need to register it, or you need to have your module have some sort of method that you call from your program that dynamically registers those types if that's a requirement. But yes, you can't just access arbitrary types, and I would imagine that's preferable or desirable because of security reasons, right? Maybe you don't want, especially in a multi-tenant environment, maybe you don't want other tenants to be able to just instantiate given type.
So it means if I want to use the MassTransit, I want to register a new type, I need to rebuild the code to add the new type?
That's right. Yes, at least in the current version. So, and that happens here where you use MassTransit. Here you need to actually register the message types in order for those types to be recognized as activities. So if you don't do this, then they won't be available as activities. But if you do it, then but it's probably possible to do this at runtime as well. Not for JavaScript, or maybe even for JavaScript and Liquid, because they are not bound to the IO in any case. I think this one, what does it do? Yeah, okay, so maybe the message type, you do need to do it at application startup time, because it's going to register these types with MassTransit, because here I'm adding it to this dictionary of message types key. And let's see where this is used. This is used, I guess, here, this one. Yeah, here. So here we get the message types. So this apply method is part of the MassTransit feature class. So this is basically your DI setup for MassTransit itself. And then these message types are being here that we're using it to dynamically create those types as variable types for workflow variables. And what else? And here we configure MassTransit activity options with these message types.
Okay.
Just checking where this is used then.
So can we do something like what we had in Elsa 2, where we have activity type providers that can dynamically produce these in runtime? So if I define these types somewhere in a database, it can just read the schema from there and create the activity?
Yes, and that's exactly how this works actually. So here we have the MassTransit activity type provider. So based on the message types configured in options, and this options is an I options of MassTransit activity options, which also means we could, maybe it needs a bit of refactoring, but potentially we can add more types at runtime. But of course these descriptors, this function get descriptors async is called at some point. Okay, so yeah, here it's actually gonna populate a registry, and the registry, this concept of registries in Elsa means you can add more stuff to it at runtime. So totally possible.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah. And even if you did have stuff that you also wanted to add at runtime, that does depend on your dependency, your service container to be updated. In .NET, of course, that doesn't work. You can't add services to a service provider. You would have to rebuild your service collection and then build a new service provider. I'm thinking about a solution where you have a thing called shells. And what is a shell? A shell is a different term for, well, tenant, basically. So you would have, for each tenant in your system, you would have its own service provider. And a shell allows you to select what services you want to register. So it's a wrapper around a service collection. So you would have multiple service collections, one for each tenant. And then if you have this capability to create new shells, which means creating new service collections and therefore service providers, you could also recreate them at runtime. So you can imagine having a Elsa server running, multiple tenants running on it, which means multiple shells exist. And now you want to deploy a new NuGet package, which carries maybe some activities, but maybe those activities depend on certain services. So what will happen? The system will then create a new shell for a given tenant that then also gets populated with whatever services are being registered for this shell. This is just some initial thinking at this point. It's inspired based on Orchard Core's shell system, where they have exactly this functionality that I just described.
Is something like the app domain in .NET or not?
Well, the app domain does get involved, of course, if you support loading NuGet packages at runtime, but that would be the scope of app domain, just to load in new stuff from new types from NuGet packages at runtime. But then when it comes time to build a service provider or service collection and then a service provider, that is unrelated to app domain, I think. But as I said, it's preliminary thinking. I need to do some experiments to see the feasibility of this. All right. Yeah, unless there's anything else, I say thank you for joining, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.